The UK was arguably the greatest empire in all of human history, at its height owning around a quarter of the world's total population and land area. The US in the early 19th century was only just beginning to gain significant power, having only just purchased the Louisiana Territory and having to still contend with the native conflicts due to American settlementation. But even with this vast difference in power, the only other time these two powers went to war in 1812, other than the American War for Independence, it was essentially a draw. The main reason that Britain didn't come over to destroy the Americans was a little something known as Napoleon. This poses the obvious question of, what if the UK invested more into the war? What if the war had actually ended with a winner? What if Britain won the War of 1812? The main question we need to answer here isn't how Britain can win, it's to what extent the UK is able to win. Though the British could just send over their entire army, that wouldn't be realistic, as the British weren't particularly concerned with the war during Napoleon's reign and had high war exhaustion from the Napoleonic Wars afterwards. To have the British win, we'll make some very slight changes. Firstly, we want to have the US lose slightly more battles against the British and her allies before 1814, which allows for much more public dissatisfaction to arise within the US. Some key battles and invasions which could change would be the naval battle in Lake Erie, which propped up more American successes in Canada, and the Creek War against British-aligned natives near the Mississippi, allowing for the American troops to remain divided between the North and the South. Once Napoleon in Europe is defeated for the first time, the UK will send over even greater forces to combat the Americans, though in this timeline much more of their naval invasions and their subsequent pushes will be successful, due to less war enthusiasm from the US side, the splitting of American forces, and the increased British forces. Two important new British successes would be the Battle of New Orleans and the Battle of Baltimore. Due to our relatively small changes, the British forces have now seized much more of the American major cities and have natives rising up all over the United States. Only a few months into 1815, and the US would call for a peace treaty. Sorry to interrupt the video, but I'm contractually obligated to do that YouTuber thing now. Did you know that over 80% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, P.S. I have a Discord now. The link to it should be in the description of this video, so if you want to check it out, it would be greatly appreciated. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. The UK was not in the war to annex any US territory, nonetheless to reincorporate the US into the British Empire. However, one of the first things the UK would likely demand would be the adjustment of the border in Maine to finalize a border disagreement in the region. They would then try to enforce their main aim of the war on the US, which was the protection of the Native Americans from US expansionism. The Great Lakes region, which at the time was mostly inhabited by native tribes, would be given independence as Native American land protected by the UK. The US would also be forced to give greater autonomy to the natives in their south. Finally, the US would be forced to give war reparations for Britain for starting the conflict. Those that had stood against the war, such as the Federalists, would gain a large boost in political support, potentially allowing them to survive another election season, though they would still likely collapse due to their overall unpopularity. The true political effect of this war comes just over 10 years after, with the 1828 election, which in our timeline led to the inauguration of Andrew Jackson into office. As mentioned before, the US in this timeline loses both the Creek War and the Battle of New Orleans, both of which were Andrew Jackson's most prominent victories, allowing him to use his military career to launch himself into politics. Without this, Jackson likely remains a general and never enters politics. So when the 1824 election comes around, instead of Jackson claiming most of the popular vote, it would be split between the remaining three candidates. The victor of this election in our timeline, John Quincy Adams, would gain significant ground, nearly reaching the 131 votes needed for the win. However, the other two candidates would likely still hold enough votes to prevent any person from winning outright. Despite this, the US House of Representatives would, like in our timeline, still put John Quincy Adams in the presidency. This action would be less controversial in this timeline because John Adams would have taken a majority of the votes anyway. So what, you may be thinking? Why talk about this election if Andrew Jackson's exemption doesn't affect anything? Well, in the following election, the election of 1828, John Adams faced off against Andrew Jackson for the presidency, and since Andrew Jackson isn't here, he needs to be replaced by someone else. I believe that the most likely person to run instead of Andrew Jackson is William H. Crawford, as he held some of the same points as Jackson and repeatedly considered going for president again after his failure in 1824. Additionally, he may be seen by the voters as the most popular alternative to Adams, since in this timeline he would get the second most amount of votes. So now in the 1828 election, Crawford would face off against incumbent President John Quincy Adams. This election would likely see a far more successful Adams due to Crawford not being nearly as popular as Jackson was, though I still predict that Crawford would eventually take the presidency. The main effects of Crawford's inauguration would be the lack of Jackson, as many major parts of modern America was built or at least influenced by him, most influential among these being the formation of the Democrat Party. Andrew Jackson and his supporters came together after the collapse of the Democratic Republicans to form the modern Democrat Party. Without Jackson, the Democratic Party is likely never formed. Instead, a party around Crawford would form around the more classical Jeffersonian ideals, being more left-leaning and liberal, possibly known as the Quid Party. The more conservative and right-wing groups would join the Whig Party, as Jacksonianism and the divided cause wouldn't exist in this timeline. Although since the Whig Party was named after opposition to Jackson, it would probably be called something similar to the Nationalist Party. The alteration in the main parties has made an unbelievable shift in the US's politics, being completely alien to the status quo in the modern day, or at least any other point in US history. So from this point on, it's impossible for me to predict any future specifics on the internal politics of the nation. I can, however, give you some broad strokes and changes made by the lack of Jackson. Firstly, the US's internal policies would be less effective, as Jackson in our timeline pushed through many reforms such as the Tenure of Office Act, which allowed for the president to not be burdened by the transfer of power from one president to the next. Secondly, the US would be far worse off economically, as Jackson helped to root out corruption, reform banks, lessen the costs of the Navy, and pay off national debt. In terms of foreign policy, an event such as the Trail of Tears would not take place, as it was Jackson who pushed through the Indian Removal Act, which forced Native American tribes in the South to migrate beyond the Mississippi. The lack of Jackson in office, combined with a threat from Britain due to its supporting these tribes, and the Quid Party being an anti-expansionist party, would allow for these tribes to remain in the location for far longer, perhaps even remaining there to the modern day. So overall, America is significantly weaker than in our timeline, although still quite powerful. America will still be able to show off this power in the Mexican-American War. Though America now has a staunchly anti-expansionist party, it would still likely guarantee Texas at some point, eventually leading to war with Mexico, in which America still completely dominates the Mexican army, though it would be tougher due to their weakened financial state. Due to being relatively weaker than in our timeline, and due to pressures from the anti-expansionists, it's possible that America gains slightly less land from Mexico in the peace deal. Next, looking up north, a border needs to be arranged with Canada. Due to being weaker internally, having many anti-expansionists in government, and most importantly, Britain being in a more powerful political position, instead of following the 49th all the way to the Pacific, it would instead follow the Columbia River down. Now, the overall border of the US remains relatively the same, especially when considering that the native tribes in the Great Lakes region are likely to be annexed or colonized eventually, since British focus was elsewhere, and the Americans had such a population advantage in the area. Though you will notice one major event in American history which I have yet to mention, the Civil War. Due to the absence of the northern industrial states in the Great Lakes, and the lack of a power vacuum caused by the dominance of the Democratic Party, the issue of slavery would likely continue to be pushed further down the road, meaning that slavery would likely persist even into the beginning of the 20th century. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tensions will rise between the two parties over several issues, such as interventionism, imperialism, and most prominently, over slavery. The parties would be at each other's throats, and tension would be at an all-time high by the time the First World War breaks out. The US, which would still develop a strong relationship with the UK, would send us support to the Entente, but due to pushback from the Quid Party and the US still being isolationist, a full war would be unlikely. As the 1916 US election rolls around, the tension between the slavers and abolitionists are heightened to a new extreme. Likely, due to the ongoing World War I and American reluctance to join it, the Quid Party would be put into power, which would likely be the abolitionist group of this timeline. After this, a revolution would be sparked in the South and the Great Plains. This revolution would be aided by the Germans in an effort to distract the US, but a Zimmermann telegram-style political incident would likely force the US government into the Entente, spreading the flames of war to North America. In this timeline, the Unionist side is weaker due to less industrialization in the Great Lakes, and the British being preoccupied in Europe, being unable to give much support. The European War remains relatively similar, though it's quite a bit slower than in our timeline due to lack of American troops. In North America, after initial engagements, the continent would freeze into trench warfare, slowly bleeding both sides. However, though the North is weaker, the South still stands no chance, with all the major industry being located in the North and the population disparity being extreme. The European front would come to a close in 1919, though the North American conflict could drag out all the way into the 1920s. In which case, the rest of the Entente would begin the peace conference without the US, treating it similarly to the Russians. The map of Europe remains relatively similar to our timeline, though some borders are slightly different to our own due to less pressure for self-determination coming from the US. In America, likely during the mid-1920s, the South eventually collapses. After this, a period of reconstruction would take place, possibly leading to the civil rights movement within the North growing in a similar way to the 1960s in our timeline. Overall, America is in a severely weakened state, with less territory, a weaker financial status, recovering from a destructive civil war, and more native land. Though America still has great potential, its near future does not look bright, and is about to enter a troubling and dark time. But that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to help my channel grow. Comment down below any suggestions you have for future video topics. I'm considering doing a part 2 to this video, so if you want to see that, comment down below. On screen now is a video which YouTube thinks you'll like. Stay crazy!